welcome back to Cloud Wars Live. We're digging into the digital revolution. We're delighted to have with us today Howard Boville, Senior Vice President of IBM Cloud. They've been doing some interesting things lately, and Howard is going to give us a little bit of an update on what's going on there. Howard, good morning. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Pleasure to see you as well, Bob.
So Howard, lots of work going on. You've been with IBM now, is it about a year and a half? Is that right?
It is 18 months. I joined in May of last year.
Yeah, zooming by. So Howard, what's up with you these days? What are the top things that you're working on?
We just continue to be hyper-focused on the four markets in regulated industries, healthcare, telecommunications, financial services, and government. And are just really kind of working with the industries that I've just mentioned to build capabilities that are relevant for them in a hybrid multi-cloud context. So having a lot of fun essentially building the products that I was interested in getting in my old role as a CIO, but also really working very closely with lots of different business leaders in those industries to really understand what it is they can get to deliver business value, as opposed to simply moving workloads from their environments to another environment. And the market is really responding very well to the actual thesis that we have, that having specialist clouds is where the real value can be derived.
Howard, that's a theme that you've certainly mentioned before, and the significance of, as you've said, there's no value to be gained by just shifting something from one platform to another. But you've been very bullish on the notion that once that those new sorts of clouds that you mentioned have those new sorts of capabilities for security and regulatory issues and compliance and so forth built in, that a lot of these big organizations in those four heavily regulated industries are going to move to the cloud. Can you give us a progress report on that?
Yeah, sure. So we continue to build out the actual capabilities. When I started 18 months ago, I guess if I reflect back now, what we started was an open source project for controls. So what we did was spin up three financial services groups, one for chief information and chief technology officers, the second for chief risk officers, and the third for chief information security officers, all of which have a different aperture on life and the problems that they solve for. And that was the reason for having three separate ones. The other actual guiding principle was to have them global, because we wanted to capture the subtleties or the nuances of regulations in different jurisdictions. So we pulled anchor customers or anchor prospects from all points on the compass. If you fast forward to where we are now, we've got, we started them with eight banks, but we fast forward to where we are now, we've got 70 plus financial services institutions, all contributing their actual control frames as it relates to all variants of cloud. So cloud service provider controls, but also software as a service, so third party and fourth party risk, which has been much publicized over the past 18 months. Yeah. We then take those capabilities and build them into our platform so that the community that we've created is assured that those controls sit within the environments that they're actually consuming from. And in addition, the third-party software service providers that sit on the platform also inherit the actual controls, which is of huge value to the financial services community and also to the SaaS providers themselves. And that's really where our laser focus has been in terms of developing capabilities against that and taking it directly from this increasing community that we have. It's been incredible success in terms of, you can tell, the membership reaching from 8 to 70 plus. But we're changing the charter now as we speak, because initially, as I mentioned, the charter was tied to global institutions. What we are now doing is actually going to regional, so continental, because in every jurisdiction, there are slight differences in terms of how regulators think about cloud. And Europe, where I just come from, is certainly a very vibrant market from a regulatory perspective, with a lot of conversations and policy discussions around sovereign clouds.
Howard, that is, it sounds like, quite an adventure there. And it's something that you deal with every day, 24 hours a day. But could you describe a little bit what you mean there about sovereign cloud? Because we're starting to hear that term applied not just toward issues around data, but also the software itself. And it sounds like, you're out at the forefront of what's going on with that. So what are the big concerns around sovereign? Why is that so important now?
Yeah, I mean, IBM is always at the forefront of these kind of discussions, and we're very actively involved and have been involved with policymakers around the world as to how they think about protecting their nationalistic interests, their sovereign interests, but ensure that also technology can allow them to do so. So this has been an emerging trend in terms of how nation states, sovereign states think about using technology, particularly within Europe. It started about 3 or 4 years ago when there was potentially a push to fabricate silicon chips in countries. That actually has diminished in terms of a push because of the complexity and the actual costs to do so. But it's now started to move into cloud. And as you quite rightly mentioned, Bob, it's also moving into software. So nation states are starting to think about policies whereby to consume software or to consume cloud services, the provider has to have a majority stake within its legal entity within the country that it provides services. And that's leading to a whole range of different thought processes as to how you'd accommodate that, one of which is forming partnerships within country entities that actually are headquartered there and building capabilities with them.
And Howard, I also just wanted to come back and see if you could connect that too with those 3 different groups of C-level officers that you described there, and why it was so important to have something that appeals specifically to each of those 3 groups. Can you just expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so actually I'll put it into a kind of a context of the 3-legged stool of what all of those 3 groups will think about. And all of that is wrapped in terms of how can they move at a very quick rate and pace to help their companies still remain relevant to the marketplaces that they operate within. And to do that, the guiding principle that any leader would have would be around 3 areas. The first is, how are they deriving the highest level of productivity from the assets that they have employed to compete in the marketplaces, whether they're people, software, cloud capabilities, infrastructure capabilities, and their supply chain. The second is how they actually get value creation from that. So how does the work with all of those components, all of those raw materials, if you like, deliver value for their customers and their shareholders? But the third area is the actual controls. So what controls do they have to be adherent to still operate in a way that they're getting the optimal level of productivity and value creation? And the thesis that we've been working on and started with, and is proven to be completely correct, is the ability to actually get a productivity and value creation at a very quick pace can be either impeded or accelerated by how thoughtful you are about the controls that you have to live within. And therefore, working with a platform, which is IBM's platform for regulated industries, where we built these controls in from the outset, means that that's one element of the 3-legged stool you don't have to worry about. And in addition to that, you know that you're working within the wisdom of clouds and crowds, because we're actually taking the community control frameworks, and therefore everything gets a little bit better based upon the different risk postures institutions have. And that's all baked into what we build. All of that means that we de-risk cloud consumption and all its variants, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and also software as a service. But it means they can get after value creation and productivity far more quickly.
And Howard, along those lines, you mentioned the wisdom of the crowd. I wanted to ask you, was it difficult to convince 70 plus financial institutions, each of which wants to be successful in its own right, to share some of these ideas and in some ways best practices? Or it sounds like an ideal situation, but I imagine there was some hesitancy among some of them, right? So how did you do that?
It's like anything. Getting a large thing moving requires a lot of energy initially, but then it starts to actually build momentum. Or you could also look at kind of the law of network effects. So when we started with 8, if half of that 8 participating banks would share with other banks, that would get us to 12. So therefore, a movement forward, but not large. But when you get to 50% of 70, you then get 35, which then becomes 105. And you start to get an exponential lift in terms of the number of institutions that are interesting to do this. Now, initially, when you start with an idea as an entrepreneur for a new business, you need to understand whether that idea actually has got market relevance. And that was the initial concerns when we started this endeavor to build industry clouds. Obviously, IBM was the first cloud provider to declare the whole notion of industry clouds. But now we've got to this growing momentum. It's evident that the problem that we're solving for is one that's a global problem. The secondary element is beyond the three councils. We do a lot of work, and IBM always has, as I've mentioned earlier, with policymakers. So we work with policymakers, lawmakers, regulators, to also get soundings in terms of the approach that we have, and ensuring that we're actually helping them on their core mission, which is to de-risk cloud consumption. And in the case of financial services, to ensure that there's no systemic risk introduced into the environment from things such as concentration risk, things such as cybersecurity, and so on. And that has resonated really well with the policymakers and the actual regulators, as with 3 central banks and the European Central Bank last week, all talking through how we drive this as a collective approach to policy. And then the final point around this is, at no point has IBM declared that this will be a proprietary advantage that we have, that you can only get these controls from IBM's cloud. We've always had the design philosophy that the world will be hybrid and multi-cloud, and therefore the capabilities that we provide can extend to other cloud providers, and does extend to other cloud providers, and also extend to your on-premise environment, meeting this design philosophy, the strategy that our Chief Executive, Arvind Krishna, has us on in terms of hybrid multi-cloud. We do that through a capability called Satellite, which allows customers to build once and run anywhere, which helps with a regulatory concern around interoperability and portability, particularly in the event of an IT operational issue or a cybersecurity issue. But it also means that customers can do with cloud what they've always done on premise, which is to make decisions as to where they place their workloads relative to the risk posture of the actual supporting business processes. So obviously the deepest level of controls, particularly with the confidential compute capabilities that we have, sit with IBM. But other providers' capabilities are far better suited and best positioned in, say, the front office processes. IBM's heritage is in the mid office and the back office. And that's tied because of our mainframe platform. Our mainframe runs the systems of records in the back office processes for all of these industries. And that essentially is the sun in our solar system, and our capabilities then will orbit around that. Not dissimilar to, say, Microsoft with their productivity suite being the sun within their solar system that sits more in the front office business processes, and everything they have orbits around those processes. So we see, as I've always mentioned, very limited competition with the different cloud providers, because we're very clear on the swim lanes that we have. And it ties to the heritage assets that IBM has delivered to with great value for our customers for decades.
Yep, yep. Howard, it sounds like a big challenge, and that you're well into this. Can I ask, so all the points that you've raised here, specifically around these things with heavily regulated industries, would IBM, with the hybrid cloud platform strategy and that being the core here, so is IBM open to working with, you mentioned Microsoft, Amazon, Google Cloud as part of this?
Yeah, we work very closely with all of those companies, both in a go-to-market, an operational, and an engineering basis. We believe that we're uniquely positioned as a consequence of that, and we're meeting customers not only where they are, but where they want their architectures to be. In our context, we don't turn up saying the answer is cloud. What's the question? We're more interested in understanding the problem and how customers derive business value. And with the rich palette of services that we have with IBM Consulting, our software portfolio, our hardware portfolio, our cloud portfolio, and the very rich range of ecosystem partners that include Azure, AWS, Google, and Alibaba, which we've done integrations into as well, we feel we're best positioned to help customers on this very complex journey to actually derive value from a technology component, which is cloud, to deliver business value for their shareholders.
Howard, thanks. That's interesting to know. I just wasn't aware that you had established that strong relationship, because there was a point at which IBM was trying to, be a full-time player in that infrastructure service. So I think it's very consistent with what you've said throughout here about the openness and driving that unique type of value that IBM has now its own lane and its own niche here in which to work. So yeah, I think that's got to be something that, especially in those big regulated industries, big banks, they have enough things going on, as you've described, that they don't want to have to come in here and referee fights among technology providers.
Absolutely. So we're not interested in go to war. We're interested in making peace treaties and ensuring that everyone can kind of collaborate together in a meaningful way. And that does require some deep levels of engineering in terms of getting the interoperability across the different platforms, how you think about the operating models to provide a seamless experience for customers, and working with customers based upon whatever operating model that they would want to work within. We separated with our strategic outsourcing business last week, which is Kyndryl, which will be a very successful business as a standalone business. But one element that we had as a constraint as IBM, which is now primarily a technology company, was that we came in with a very prescriptive approach in terms of how you would do day two run. We felt that business model wasn't appropriate for the assets, the technology assets that we now have as a company. We wanted to have flexibility and provide choice to our customers. And therefore, it was important for us to make that separation. It also helps Kyndryl be very focused on the actual business that they have and also have the relationships that they would need to have to be successful in that domain. So separating the two obviously creates opportunity for both companies and is entirely aligned with the strategy that Arvind brought in April of last year, which is that we're an open hybrid multi-cloud provider. And if you think about kind of the steps to that journey, IBM has always been very active in open source. We're one of the key founders in Linux when it first came around. But with the acquisition of Red Hat, we're a key open source provider distributor, and it's very much now within the philosophy of how we think about working with customers and meeting them to meet their needs.
And Howard, the last question I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a moment ago IBM Consulting, which had been global business services. And it's always seemed like that is just an incredible combination that IBM can have here, the technological teams that you're leading and those very deep industry expertise that IBM Consulting now has. So good progress on that.
Great progress. Double-digit growth over the last quarter. Mark Foster, John Granger, Kelly Chambliss are doing a superb job in terms of driving that business in the right direction. We're all very happy that we've now called it what it is, which is consulting. So that's also helpful in the marketplace. And it's playing really well in terms of the approach they take as a consulting practice. So from the brands that we have, the capabilities, clearly we're opinionated about the business value that we can deliver with them. The beautiful thing that IBM Consulting provide is that they are non-opinionated. They will actually work with a customer and then work with a broader range of partners. So they are actually the key element of the partnerships that we have with Microsoft, AWS, and other providers, and are doing really well in terms of the level of capabilities and skills that they have and the deep partnerships on that operational side. From a brand perspective, we're leading the way in terms of the engineering across the different platforms to ensure that the points of integration are there.
Well, Howard, that's great. It's heartening to hear, all this progress on many fronts. As you said, a lot of hard work going into putting together first that 8, then the 70, coming together nicely. Howard, anything else you wanted to be sure to mention as we wrap up?
The key thing about IBM now is to understand what it is as opposed to what it was. We understand that will take time. But in the same way as we're an open company that provides choice, it's great to have these opportunities to actually reposition IBM as a company and get people to understand with an open mind where we are. But what I would say is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I just come back from a European trip where I was in the UK, France, Germany, and Spain last week. And I met with 30 customers. And the level of positivity towards the IBM brand and this pivot that we're making as a company as we go through the next transformation, of which IBM has been through many in its 100+ years, is being really, really well received, particularly the approach around being hybrid, on-prem, off-prem, and multi-cloud. We created a number of firsts when IBM declared under Arvind the actual strategy of hybrid multi-cloud. That gave many CIOs an ability to actually breathe out and say, okay, I'm not the Luddite after all, things will still be on premise and things will be multi-cloud. Yeah. And then when we declared as a first the industry clouds, and then with the imitation is the best form of flattery, the other cloud providers following, it's good to see that IBM's now in a position where we're innovating at the way we are. The final point I'll make in terms of the other cloud providers having their industry offerings, again, we don't see that as competitive because each cloud provider comes from where their strengths and their assets are. And I mentioned, obviously, Microsoft very strong in the front office space as it relates to their Outlook offerings. We're more in the mid office and back office areas. So it actually allows everybody to be a lot clearer as to where the swim lanes are and where we all operate and where we can deliver value.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time, Howard. And with that, as booming as the entire cloud market is overall, I think the industry cloud business in at least 22 and 23, it's going to be the hottest segment, of that whole category. It's just something that customers seem to be, as you alluded to a moment ago, it's like, okay, finally, they've got something that I really want and need, and I'm ready for.
Good. Well, thank you, Bob. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I always enjoy the conversation and the questions.
Thank you, Howard. It's been great to see you. Thanks for your time here today. And folks, thanks for being with us here at Cloud Wars Live for this conversation with IBM Senior Vice President Howard Boville. See you next time.